Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at another game from day 2 of the 2017 Champions Showdown. The Champions Showdown, if you're not familiar, there's 8 of the top players in the world, and each of them is matched up against one opponent for 4 days, and they play 30 games against that opponent, mix of rapid and blitz chess. So you can imagine 30 days over 4 days. It's got to be pretty fast chess. First day, they play 4 games of 30-minute games. Then the next day, day 2, which we're going to be talking about today, they play 6 games, and they each have 20 minutes to play. And then getting into the third day, they have 10 minutes, and they're going to be playing 8 games. And then on the last day, they'll be playing 12 games of 5 minutes apiece. Our competitors today, white is played by Alexander Grischuk, his opponent playing the black pieces, Fabiano Caruana. In day 1, they ended up tying as far as wins and losses. Both sides did get a win on day 1, and then they drew a couple games. Coming into day 2, both of these individuals have a win, and they've tied a bunch as well. So getting into this last game of the day, game number 6, the 10th game so far. Both sides looking to get a victory and go into day 3 with a lead. So we'll go ahead and get started. Alexander Grischuk starts with pawn to d4. Pawn to d5, pawn c4, and then we see pawn take on c4. So not only do we not see pawn to d4 very often, we don't see the queen's gambit very often. We definitely don't see the queen's gambit accepted line. Most of the time we're seeing queen's gambit decline line, but queen's gambit accepted line, and then pawn to e4. So aptly named the central variation. More common, you're going to be seeing knight to f3. This is the main line, but hey, with rapid style chess, you never know what you're going to see. So Alexander Grischuk decides to play pawn to e4 and then knight to f6. Pretty much forces the play of pawn to e5 and then knight d5, bishop takes on c4. You're always going to get that material back in the queen's gambit accepted line, and this brings the knight back here to b6. Bishop comes back here to d3. Had a few options. Could have played bishop to b3 if you wanted to, but decided to play bishop to d3. If you haven't seen this position, or if you haven't really thought too much about chess in general, you have to be aware of things like this where your opponent is playing where they're kind of baiting you to take here on d4. Always be looking for these. This would be a trap because queen can't take. Bishop to b5 check. There's a discovered attack, and the queen is going to fall. Even if the queen comes back here to defend this, he is going to fall. At the top level play, Fabiano Caruana is not going to play and fall into that trap, but just want everyone who's watching this to make sure that if you see this in your own games, do not fall for this if you ever see this in a position. Knight to c6, attacking this backward pawn here on d4. Knight to e2, could have easily played knight to f3 to also protect this as well. Bishop to g4, and essentially needs to play pawn to f3, trying to attack this minor piece that's defending the square here on d4. Black has both his knight and his queen both defending this, so really needs to make sure he holds on with his knight on e2 to defend the square on d4. Caruana kicks his bishop back to h5, bishop to e4, pawn e6, getting control of the light squares in the center of the board, also opening up for his dark square bishop to develop. Then if he wants to castle on the king side, he can do that. Castle on the king side for Grischuk, and then Caruana plays bishop to g6. And it would be a mistake to take this right here, and you can see that Caruana waited for white to castle on the king side, but if the bishop were to take, now the pawn could take on g6, and this is a very strong attack that black would have on the king side of the board. This king is already not super safe because the pawn's already pushed forward to f3, and now with this rook on h8, it can really start to attack his opponent, and black hasn't committed to one side of the board. This would be different if Caruana had castled on the king side. It would be a little safer to exchange with the bishop here on g6, but because he has not, this would definitely be a bad exchange for Alexander Grischuk. If he wanted to exchange over here hey, that's completely fine. You could have the pawn recapture. This is going to have double isolated pawns on the c-file. That I think is completely fine. You're no longer going to have the bishop pair, but that is an option. Decides instead to play bishop to e3, continuing his development. Bishop to e7. Caruana has a few options. He can castle on the king side right away, or if he wants to, he can get his queen involved, castle on the queen side. Pawn to a3, stopping the knight coming down to b4, or the bishop to b4. So both sides just trying to kind of feel their opponent out and see what both sides are looking to do here. Queen to d7, knight to c3, just simple development, and then castle on the queen side. So both sides is kind of giddy up time, and they know what they need to do. Throw everything at their opponent's opposite side of the board. Alexander Grischuk is going to be looking to develop on the queen side, and Caruana is going to be looking to pressure the king side of the board. Now, as far as how you attack the queen side of the board, you can get your queen involved. You could play pawn to b4 if you wanted to. You have some options. Grischuk decides to go ahead and play queen to c2, which is completely fine. Pawn to f5, so black looking to attack the king side of the board, and we start to see some exchanges come off. Bishop takes on c6, queen recaptures on c6, and then bishop comes back to f2. And this is one of those where I think white could have played a little bit more aggressive here. He had the option of knight to f4. This allows your opponent to make a mistake. This pawn, backward pawn on e6 is only defended by the queen here on c6. So depending on how black wants to continue, he may not recognize in a rapid style. You don't have as much time to think. And this just makes his opponent always weary of, yeah, my opponent has a knight here on f4 and it's attacking this pawn on e6. He doesn't really have that threat to worry about if the bishop comes back here to f2. So I prefer to get the knight more involved with f4. Now, pawn to f4, and we start to see both sides really trying to have control of this f4 square. Queen down to c1, bishop to g5. Now the knight takes, king over here to b8, knight down here to e2, just everything going to defend the square here. Queen back here to e8 to defend this bishop here on g6. Bishop to e3, trying to hold down the fort here. Bishop to f5, nice little outpost move from black. Rook over here to d1. Says I have a backward pawn here, and since I have everything already covering the square here on f4, I'm going to move my attention over to this pawn, because if things start to exchange over here, I do want to make sure that I have something protecting this backward pawn on d4, since my opponent is threatening with his rook here on d8. At this point, Caruana decides to strike first. You know, we have all this material lining up on this f4 square. Grischuk says, hey, if you ever want to take it, I have 3 pieces that are ready to exchange at any given time. Caruana says, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. I will give up my bishop pair. Let's go ahead and exchange. That's exactly what white does. So the bishop takes, pawn comes down here to h6, pawn comes back e3, knight d5 attacking the bishop. Says, okay, that's fine. I'll just recapture with my queen. Knight here to c3, getting into a better spot on the board. Pawn g5 starting to push on the king side of the board as we expected from black. And then we see an exchange in the center. Rook takes here on d5. But I think this is good for white. He has a better pawn structure. Black has a isolated pawn here on the e-file. While both sides have equal pawns, I think the pawn structure for white is better. And so with this, I think white getting into the endgame has a better potential to come out with a win. You know, they definitely could still tie. It's not a guaranteed win by any means, but definitely like the threats that white has in the center of the board. Pawn to h3, rook to g8, just getting ready to push forward with his pawns here. Pawn b3, queen e7, rook here to a2, bishop to g6. Both sides just maneuvering a little bit. Pawn a4 starting to push on the queen side. Bishop to e8 trying to stop some of the push on the queen side of the board. Queen to a3 says, yeah, if you want to exchange on board, I think I have a winning endgame, and so let's go ahead and do this. Many times, especially top-level players, they're not going to do this, especially if you can look at the board and reasonably think that they have a good position. They wouldn't exchange their queens unless they felt like they had a technical win where it was just execution. It would be very difficult for them to lose the win. So in this position, Caruana says, yeah, I'm not looking to do that right now, so I'm going to bring my queen over here to h7. Pawn to b4, so continuing the push on the queen side. Pawn h5, bishop back here, f2. Pawn g4, pawn takes back on g4. Pawn h4, and then pawn to g3. And this, I think, was a mistake on board. I'm not sure that Caruana recognized that the queen was here on a3. He was probably looking at it and said, pawn to g3, my rook is defending this, so I think this is a great square. And the reason I say that is white immediately took here on g3, and then Fabiano Caruana took a few minutes to actually look at what to do next. He hadn't taken more than 2 minutes for any move up until this entire spot. And if he really thought that this was going to happen after he played pawn to g3, I don't think he would have taken too much time. So just giving up a pawn material for not really an advantage at all. I really just think with so little time on the clock at this point, he didn't see the queen. He thought he was starting to have a strong attack. But bishop to g3 was a snap move from Alexander Grischuk. It was 1 second on. You can look and see how long each of the moves took. It took 1 second for him to see this. So he knew that his queen was here on a3, even if Fabiano Caruana did not. Bishop comes to g6, pawn to b5. So you can see white starting to push the advantage here. Bishop f5. It is a nice little outpost, although doesn't really do too much right now. Queen to e3. This does centralize the queen. I'm not sure that it is the best spot if he's trying to have the queen hold down this pawn on d4. I think it's better just to play queen to c3. It just stops some of his attacks by playing queen to e3. This is more defensive in my opinion. But rook back to d7. Now decides to push forward. Pawn to d5. Rook over here to g7, decides not to take this. I thought we might actually see the pawn take on d5. This does give a pawn to black in exchange for an attack for white to push forward with his passed pawn. He could first come over here with rook to f1, force the bishop to move, and then push forward if he wanted to with his pawn. But in the game, we did not see the pawn take. Instead, rook over here to g7. Caruana is thinking his best plan is just to overload the king side and see if he can have a really strong attack and come out with a victory. White decides to continue with pawn taking on e6, and then the bishop takes back on e6. It would be a mistake if you look at it and say, well, he's overloaded the bishop here on g3. Let's just go ahead and take that. Unfortunately, this rook on g8 is not protecting the rook here. The queen can freely take. Caruana can't recapture here. The rook would come up here. This would be checkmate. So while he is double barreling the rooks here, he can't take the bishop. He's forced to take with his bishop here on e6. Now rook to a3. This is just lining up, making sure that all of his pieces are protecting this bishop here on g3. Pawn to b6, so this is good. This allows himself the option if he ever has an exchange, and there's only one piece defending it. Right now there's both the rook and the queen, but if the rook does come down to d8, he doesn't fall victim to a back rank mate, he can always bring his king here to b7 and have safety. Queen here to f2, a rook to f7, forcing the queen to move, queen e1. Now queen down to c2, starts to attack that. Rook to c1. The queen moves. Rook over here to c3, just double barreling. This is exactly what you want to do. So both these rooks attacking the square here on c7 forces the rook on f7 to hold down the 7th rank. Rook to g7. Rook here to c2, forcing the queen to move. Queen to b4. And this is where things get kind of crazy. The rook comes up here to c6. White has a strong advantage, but this is not the best play. A few things are happening with this. The first thing is after rook to c6, we're attacking the bishop on e6, but there's also a discovered attack. The queens are now attacking each other. Very, very huge attack from both sides of the board. But this also opens up the door for the queen to take here. if black looks at it and says, okay, you're attacking my queen here, first and foremost, I have to look at that. He could easily just take with his queen on a4, and then white's in a tough spot. He would love to take with his rook here on e6. That's part of the reason that he was up there. But then he's just going to lose his rook here on c2, and that's not good. And this is going to be a game that Caruana can easily win. So the rook up here on c6 is somewhat a mistake. Fortunately for Alexander Grischuk, because there's not a lot of time on the clock, his mistake was overshadowed by the even bigger mistake, and that is the rook coming down here to g3. Yes, this is a free bishop to take here, Caruana. The problem is you just lost your queen. You didn't see the queen taking here on b4. Caruana is forced to immediately resign. After this, the rook here on c2 is protecting, so the rook can't come down here. Down a queen of material is always going to be tough to come back. So Alexander Grischuk takes the 10th and final game in day 2. So going into day 3, the blitz portion, he has a game in hand against Fabiano Caruana. So playing a great tournament so far, Alexander Grischuk. This has been a fun series, just the Champions Showdown so far. We've had lots and lots of crazy games. With so little time for these players to think, you really start to see some wild strategies that you would never see in other formats. So hopefully you guys are enjoying this tournament so far, and I will see you guys in day 3 for some of the coverage. And then day 3, Magnus Carlsen kicks off. We have 8 competitors, but 6 of those competitors started yesterday. Magnus Carlsen and Ding Lian start tomorrow. They will go from Saturday to Tuesday. So while we do have 4 days for all the competitors, they have spaced it out a little bit, which will be nice. That will allow me to do more commentary over a longer period of time. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.